Hi, I'm Jennifer Edwards, and I teach medieval and ancient history at Manhattan College in the Bronx, where I am professor and chair of history. This past spring, I had the opportunity to teach my usual upper division Britain to 1688 history course as a digital arts and humanities course. Our program at Manhattan College requires assignments to have 3 components: to have focus on data collection, data analysis, and data presentation. So I'm going to share my full assignment with you, but I think that you could do any portion of it usefully. This assignment was an early one in the class, which was intended to really introduce students to using Excel. And the way I did that was to consider the Domesday book and to have them do a data analysis using Excel, learning how to use Excel, and the Prosopography in Anglo-Saxon England website. And here's the assignment. What we used was the Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England site, which is great because it has the database where you can look up specific information within the site, but it also has the data downloadable as a CSV file, so that students could bring it into Excel on their own computers or on a computer lab computer and then play around with the data without having to work through the online database. Or they could go for more sophisticated things, but we were really just interested in how do you get data into Excel and what do you do with it once it's there. Because the database is called the Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, that became an important moment for us to have an early conversation in the class about what does Anglo-Saxon mean? How is that term received? What are the alternatives for the period that we're referencing with that term? And I think that that was a really important conversation, especially as the spring semester played out. To have had that conversation, I think kind of contextualized a lot of our other conversations later on as we got deeper into looking at the Anglican, for example. Okay, so here we have basically the data of the Domesday book with the information of who held what property in 1066 and then where that property was in 1086. So very simple. The students also read excerpts of the Domesday book in other sites, and I'll link to a couple of different options for those. What I had students do is they simply downloaded the table, and it came down as a CSV file. That takes a lot of time, so I've already downloaded it here for us. As a Mac user, I found that the data came down as a numbers file, and then I would have to convert it. But I found if I tried to open from my Finder, just to open it with Excel, it would introduce all kinds of mistakes. So I found that it was easier to open the numbers file, copy everything, and then paste that into Excel. Students who use PC, it just opens right up. But students who use a Mac had to do these extra steps. So the first thing I had students do was to insert a row where they could put, let's take the bold off of this row, but put it onto this one. And I wanted students to just label the columns. So that they would know what data they were looking at in their own file without having to continually look back. Okay, and one thing none of my students had really known how to do, so this was an incredibly useful tip for them. Sorry, I'm going to take the bold off of everything. Was they didn't know how to freeze a row. So they didn't know that they could just go into that second row, freeze the pane, and then when they scroll, the information would stay at the top. So a lot of students had used Excel, but just didn't know that one tip. And I think right there they felt there were oohs and ahs in the classroom about that. Okay, so now that we're here, the first thing they have to do is check the data. So they had to go back to the original site and compare the data they had to see if they needed to clean anything. And for those students who were Mac users who didn't do those extra steps, they found that data came in with all kinds of weird symbols. You know, an umlaut would come in with an ampersand or something. And so they would have to correct those errors to make sure that they had a clean set of data. So my assignment, you know, collect the data and then check it to make sure that it transferred correctly. And then I sent the students back to the PASE site to think about, you know, where did the data come from? What were the methods they used? What goals did they have? Kind of, what do the abbreviations mean? All of that. And students were supposed to write a little bit about just what it meant to collect the data and any issues that they had while they did that. Now we get to move into the analysis. And so the students were doing some very simple sorts. For example, they would come to the gender column and they would sort that information A to Z. It's very important. They didn't always know that they had to expand the selection to keep the column they're sorting in the context of the rest of the Excel worksheet. So sometimes we just sorted that column and all of the information became divorced from the rest of the information. So it's really important to expand that selection. And now we have all of the records identified as female at the top. There's about 17,000 records, but only 479 are identified as female. So that was an interesting sort just at the top. There are 3 categories in this list: female, male, and unknown. So we had conversations about what does it mean to be unknown. So once they had that list, we came to the description field to see how were the people who held property in this list, especially those who had property in 1066, and they were women, what kinds of women held that property? What kinds of women made it into the document? Already we know that it was such a small portion of the overall data set, but then who gets in here? And the students were noticing, hey, these are noble women, queens, countesses, or they're abbesses, or they're related to somebody who has status. So that provided for a lot of useful conversations about women in Anglo-Saxon England, in early medieval England. Then when we sorted again, let's see if we put, we just undo. And now if we sort the names column, A to Z, we're probably going to have a lot more men at the top. But now the students could start to look at, some names repeat an awful lot. Alfgar, and they noted, they wanted to know about that funny letter, that AE that were joined together. What does that mean? And we talked a lot about, you know, why Alfred, for example, was a very important name. Why were people naming their children according to some of these styles? That became useful. Another way we sorted the data was just to see who owned how much property. So it made a lot of sense that Edward, King of England, held the most property in 1066, right? That Harold would own a sizable amount of money, that Stigand, the Archbishop, would have a sizable amount of property, that the Queen would be right? So this made a lot of sense. And simply by sorting the data this way, they were able to kind of suss out some of that, the kind of social and cultural history of the time too. Okay, another thing that students did is that we made this into a table. And once we did that, we could format, we could filter some information. So say here, we want to have only, that's not going to help us, but if we came here and we only wanted to have female and undefined, but not the rest. Now we could get a much easier sense of how many people were female. And whether there were other categories here. For this data set, the filtering isn't super exciting, but it is for other data sets that we looked at later on. And so it was a useful tool for them to learn. And then we could talk about why it's not so easy to filter here, and we might need to use other tools to understand who was an abyss or to bring them out of the information. So I want to go back to no filter, or clear the filter. So those are just a couple of tools to be able to use this data in Excel that my students were playing around with, and they could do some analysis this way that they didn't get just from reading the prose descriptions, the prose versions of the Domesday book. Another tool that we used, and I think this works best for the description column, is we just copied this column, right? And then we went over to Voyant, which is an open source tool available online, voyanttools.org. And you can search, you can use any corpus here, just cut and paste information to create a corpus. And then Voyant will present to us a number of ways of analyzing that corpus. And one of the more interesting ones is this word cloud, the cirrus here. So obviously 1066 and 1086 are among the largest numbers, but you can add in some stop terms. So you can take 1066 and 1086 out and then understand what's going on in that description column. And it'll show you which words are used most. And for the description column of the PASE website, to think about somebody being the man of somebody else is interesting, right? There's a number of different ways to analyze this data here using Voyant. So you've got the trends over what's used kind of consistently throughout. It changes the corpus you give them into decimals. So these are just 10 units. It's not like chapters or anything. And you can look at the context, what happens before or after a certain term. Yeah, this became much more exciting when we used Voyant to look at things like Beowulf. You know, we were able to get a PDF of Beowulf, copy the full text, paste it into here, and then look at, you know, how does Beowulf appear differently in the word cloud where you see what words are used most commonly. The fact that free is used so frequently here, that it's such a large word, that became an interesting topic of conversation. William is there. William is creeping up as a popular name, right? Why is that? Etc. So this is, for my students, it became an exciting way to think about Excel, what Excel could do for them. And the writing they had to do was pretty mechanical, to explain what was interesting or unexpected, what was significant about the information they found. And I asked them to describe both what was interesting that they found and approaches they took that didn't turn up anything interesting, because that's also important. They had to come up with questions for us to analyze when we came back together. And so we were using Slack. They were posting questions that then focused our conversation. They were writing about how they manipulated the data, what kind of problems they had. And then they were using screenshots of what they found that was interesting to create a PowerPoint presentation that they then also shared into Slack. And that was our way of presenting it. So they wrote a paper that included those components that they had written about in step 1 and step 2, and then the PowerPoint slide sort of put it all together. They really loved this assignment because it was really functional, and they were allowed to talk about what worked and what didn't. They were using a lot of their own analysis, but they found themselves also talking about primary sources in the documents and how what they found through the data compared with what they found in more of the prose description. So that is my assignment on how to use Excel to do some data analysis from the Prosopography in Anglo-Saxon England website.